Thank you everyone for joining our Lunch and Learn hot topic, how to protect and how to recover from Active Directory and Entra ID with Commvault, today's host, today's sponsor. I'm joined with Dan Conrad. Thanks for joining, Dan.
Great to be here. Thanks.
Awesome. We have an action-packed agenda here. Again, just to create some context, I often preach being to the right and the left of the boom being an incident, right, and an event. The left of the boom is being able to protect, have a list of asset inventories, in this case, identity, Active Directory, Entra ID, validating that list against daily changes or changes that happen in a regular cadence, in a regular fashion. That being the left of the boom, be able to protect those assets. The right of the boom is in the event of, equally as important, the event of an incident, how do we recover from that incident? So today we're going to focus on, I believe, the right of the boom, and what you'll see is live recovery with Active Directory and Entra ID, how to locate and restore deleted user groups and OUs, cross-forest recovery scenarios that Dan will drive us through. We'll understand how to protect against ransomware and malicious changes within your environment. And again, dive a little deeper into granular versus full AD recovery options, because it is the thing. So before getting started, again, thank you for joining. Instructions, Ernesto at Assurance IT, Dan at Commvault. Dan will be driving us through the demo, and we'll save, I guess, the last 5-10 minutes for some question and answers.
I'm going to throw just a couple of slides to talk through what I'm going to show you today. And again, I'm Dan Conrad from Commvault, but we're talking specifically about Active Directory resilience. So we're going to talk about Active Directory resilience. Now, I would like to preface this to say, legacy. I'm not a legacy Commvault person, so I'm a legacy Active Directory person. And in fact, I was one of those legacy Windows NT people. So I've been working with Active Directory for 25 plus years now. And thinking back, had I known the path I was choosing, inadvertently choosing, I don't know if I would have reconsidered or what, but Active Directory is still around today, so we need to protect it. And it's one of those things that's sort of faded into the mist, but is still holding up the infrastructure from an authentication perspective. And the reason we talk about this is there's sort of an assumption that Active Directory is extremely resilient and doesn't need to be recovered ever because of this multi-master replication model, and just adding more DCs adds more redundancy. While that's true from a directory corruption perspective and from an authentication perspective, when an attacker comes into your organization or something catastrophic happens against Active Directory, it happens to the entire directory. So the whole directory may be offline, parts of the directory may be offline. And I've seen variations of that throughout my 25 years of working with AD, where, an organization lost their entire directory, no question, got to recover that. That's pretty obvious. But when things happen and admins make mistakes, that was the big thing. I spent a lot of time correcting or fixing mistakes. We need to be able to bounce back from those. Especially when you're looking at larger organizations that have maybe consolidated. I'm thinking of an organization I worked in, and it was a consolidation of about 100 different organizations. And then within there, we granted permissions within those organizations to manage their own section of the directory. And when we had that, we had to recover from a lot of errors. So we spent a lot of time putting the right things in place so that we could actually recover from those errors. Now, the things I'm going to talk to you about today, like I said, I'm not a Commvault person. I'm not a legacy Commvault person. In fact, I've really only been at Commvault a little over a year, but I've been working with Active Directory and recovery for 25 years. But everything I'm going to show you today and talk about is built on the Commvault platform of resilience. So you think about the control plane. When I'm going to recover an object or even set up a backup for Active Directory, there's a control plane I log into, and I'll refer to that many times. So the control plane is where I access my backups, I set up my backups, and even set up my recoveries. Commvault has a very, very secure or very strong control plane here, where I've got things like multi-factor authentication into the control plane, even things like multi-person authentication for certain tasks. So I'll show you when we're going to do a forest recovery. You may want a two-person integrity check on a forest recovery to prevent you from accidentally recovering into production when you don't need to. But then in integration with literally everything else, so whether it's your PAM solution like CyberArk or Beyond Trust or any of the other pieces of SOAR and SIM, that's all built into the Commvault platform. I just take that for granted that it's there, and I'm just going to use it for my Active Directory recovery. Underneath the covers are many things like risk analysis of your environment. So looking at changes in the environment. When Commvault's backing things up, there's a lot of opportunity to look for data or control points in there to indicate compromise or to indicate anomalies. So we're going to be able to look at those and as things are being backed up. One thing you really want to make sure of when you're talking about Active Directory recovery is immutable storage. I've seen a customer that actually had a very strong Active Directory resilience solution, but they did not have it on immutable storage. In fact, it was joined to the Active Directory domain and therefore was not really immutable at all. So immutable storage is a key part of that. And there's a lot of data protection rules that the Commvault big brains get into around multiple copies of your backup, where they should be in the different types of media that those should be on. But all that's underneath the infrastructure of Commvault. The ability to scan threats within your backup environment as they're being backed up is very critical as well. So if I need to do a forest recovery and the threat scan has detected that there's malware on a domain controller that I need to recover, it's going to prohibit me from actually restoring that piece of malware while I recover the domain controller. So that's the underlying infrastructure that I'm just overlaying or just using as part of Active Directory resilience today. And then a point that I've been developing, it sort of hit me out of the blue a few months ago, where I realized that many of the organizations I've been working with at Commvault, or whether they're using a Commvault as a data protection vendor or other vendors, or even building their own AD resilience plans without a solution, without a third-party solution, is they're still depending on Active Directory to recover Active Directory. Now I know that sounds a little bit obvious, right? Like I can't use the solution I'm recovering to recover this solution. And I've made that mistake in a different venue, from a story many years ago, where I was, recovering a storage area network, and I had put my database for my control plane on the storage area network. It's not going to work. But Active Directory is the same way. You can't assume that authentication is going to be available. And even a control plane that might be domain joined, you can't assume that that's going to be available when planning to recover Active Directory. And in fact, Active Directory is most likely going to be one of the very first pieces of your recovery in a real cyber event. Now, let me differentiate between a disaster recovery and a cyber recovery, where a disaster recovery would be, an outage, or, maybe a tree falls on your server rack, something like that. Hopefully that's not possible. But things where individual applications or parts of a data center are affected, that's disaster recovery. I mean, given the right circumstances, those can be recovered. And you can actually use Active Directory to recover those. But when we're talking about cyber recovery, we're talking about the entire infrastructure is compromised, including the authentication infrastructure. So if you're depending on Active Directory to access your data protection layer, you need to reconsider that. And then we have a number of solutions at Commvault that sort of make you think there. I say this is one of those hand to the forehead moments where I've learned so many things the hard way, sort of like talking to my son. I want to communicate some of these. Now, some of them go through, and some of them he still needs to put his own hand to the forehead when it happens. But I'm passing this on to you to say this is how I would like you to view it. View it as infrastructure, and consider that it may not be available when you go to do a recovery. And then the reason we talk specifically about Active Directory as a workload or a recovery workload is because it's different. I've seen some organizations create what we call creative recovery solutions, where They will jump through some hoops or something that they think is going to work. And then I've had customers describe these to me, anything from taking domain controllers offline once a week and keeping them, somewhere else or whatever they're doing. And as they explain this to me, they've obviously never tried to use these backups or this plan to actually recover Active Directory. But they sort of realized maybe halfway through them telling me their solution that what they have is probably maybe a 10% chance of actually working. If they do get it back, it won't be in a pristine state and it won't be usable for quite a long time. So we have to really look at some of these recovery plans and put some careful planning and execution around that. And the complexity of Active Directory adds to that. So if you have a very simple Active Directory and you're a small business with all of your employees are in the same building, you know where they are all the time, and then you have a couple of domain controllers, that's fine. You can probably get away with something like a VMware recovery and then executing some of the forced recovery steps. But if you're a global organization with domain controllers in 5 different countries, and data centers in all over the place, it's just going to be more of a complex recovery, and that one really needs to be planned out. So let's jump over into my lab environment here, and we're going to walk through some scenarios here instead of walking through slides. So I'm looking at my Active Directory control plane. Now you can see here I've got a URL at the top, right? It's a browser, but I'm looking at a URL. It's going to Metallic IO. This is a SaaS control plane. As I was mentioning, you can't use Active Directory to recover Active Directory. Of course, this is not Active Directory. This is a SaaS control plane that is going to back up and recover my on-prem Active Directory. It's going to back up on-prem Active Directory. My storage for that Active Directory is on-prem, but it's also replicated to a third party or to a third storage tier. So it's going to go into Commvault's Air Gap Protect, which is immutable cloud storage. And then it's going to be able to recover to on-prem as well. So it's just a SaaS control plane. So don't get hung up around cloud-based Active Directory. This doesn't care where the domain controllers are. It's not even aware of where the domain controllers are, but it just has a solution to back up and recover Active Directory. And when I say Active Directory, I'm saying the real Active Directory, right? Whether it's domain controllers running on-prem, running in AWS, GCP, what have you. It doesn't really matter where Active Directory runs. And Active Directory
Dan,
domain controllers.
is there a specific like domain service level it needs to be at 2008, 2012, or we don't care?
We don't care. We don't care. There are questions. We got this question just yesterday. It said, hey, some of my domain controllers are server 2012. It doesn't show that you support that. Well, technically, Server 2012 isn't supported, so we can't necessarily say that we support it. It works fine. Active Directory is Active Directory, right? So it's pretty much the same concept. And we will recover it, obviously, to the same forest functional level. And then you can see within the control plane, I can do a lot of other things besides backing up Active Directory. So if I wanted to manage all my company laptops and my Google Workspace from the same place, I can do that. Within Active Directory, though, I have 3 different, call it areas of interest. I have granular Active Directory recovery. I'll show you that in just a second. I have Entra ID, and then I have, forest level recovery, which is a completely different concept from anything granular. So let's go into an Active Directory domain controller, and I'm going to go ahead and make a mess of some things. So we'll go into, I'm logged into one of my DCs right here, and I'll just go through and we'll take the manufacturing OU. I've got 116 objects in here, and we'll just delete those. And I'll show you what granular recovery looks like. So if I want to go through and delete all of these. Now this, we used to have issues where the admins that we delegated permissions to would accidentally delete their own OU. There's a little check block in Active Directory now. It's called Protect from Accidental Deletion, where you can keep your objects a little bit safer. Right here. I uncheck it just because I like to accidentally delete stuff, accidentally on purpose. But that little check block saves a lot of headache. So let's go back in and we'll put those users back. So I can connect to the control plane, browse to that domain controller where I delete them, and I can recover it to any of the domain controllers. And then I can do a restore job. While I'm here, we'll jump into the restore, and I believe that was the manufacturing OU. I always forget by the time I get over here which OU I deleted. So we'll come through and we'll browse. I'm browsing the backup to the manufacturing OU, and I can choose my point in time right here. So if I wanted to go back a couple of weeks, I can do that. So I'm going to put the manufacturing OU back, but let's jump into like the HR OU for a second here and take a look. I can also do comparisons. So if I wanted to see any of the user, we'll go to Astrid Perez here, and we'll see the differences between Astrid Perez's account from what it is today. Say something changed overnight or something changed in the last few days. I can go point in time backup, so one backup compared to another, or a point in time backup to the live environment. This is the one I use the most. So if I want to go back a day and see what happened to that account, I can look at the changes on that account in the last 24-hour period, I guess is what it would be. So these are all the attributes that changed in the last 24-hour period. Obviously, I have a script running that randomizes my user attributes so I can show something to somebody. But if I wanted to selectively recover those attributes, I can simply do it like this and just hit restore and it'll write those back for me. Pretty simple to do. I can see the differences between the backup and the live environment. I could compare things like group membership changes and that sort of thing. I can even track elevated permissions. So the manufacturing OU was the one I wanted to put back, or all the user objects in the manufacturing OU. The OU is still there. So we'll come over into manufacturing right here. Here's all the user objects. I can simply tag them and restore them. And we'll watch them go rebuild here.
So seeing that you can deep dive or drill down the specific domain controllers, then I'm guessing there's an agent to be installed on those DCs.
Yes, yes. So there's an agent on the DC doing this work for me. And then it's really designed to be recovered to any DC that you want to recover to. And since Active Directory is the same everywhere, you don't really need to back up every domain controller in the domain from a granular perspective because it eventually will replicate everywhere anyway. You may choose to back up one in each data center from a granular perspective and then let that replicate out in like a hub and spoke method or however you wanted to do that. I think our number was 116, right? So all the users are back. We can come back and see, let's see if some of these users have group memberships and things like that. So it puts all their group memberships back right the way they were. So, and in this case, it put the passwords back. So that's granular recovery. We can also, I showed you where we can recover at the attribute level from a granular perspective. We can do the same thing in Entra ID. So let's come back up into my main tile here. We'll go back to the service catalog and I'll come back in. So we're going to go manage and we're going to come down here to Azure AD is designated here. We've got a couple of different tenants in here. We can do the same thing on the Entra tenants perspective. So if something happens to one of my Entra tenants, usually what we'll do is we'll just come straight into a restore and pick the objects that we want to restore. I don't have a lot changing in my Entra tenant, so there's not that amusing to look at. But we can see the objects here. Let me see. So you can see where it says Windows Server AD. Those are synchronized from on-prem AD. But if we wanted to go look at Adele Vance here, let me see Vance. Adele Vance is one of my users that is not synchronized. Let it refresh. So you can see it's a little bit different. And if I wanted to recover that object, it's pretty simple. I can also look at the properties of the objects to see all of their attributes that are in the backup and see anything that might be, I don't know, whatever you would want to know about that, and be able to make decisions based on this information. So if you wanted to recover an attribute or recover an object from here, we can do the same thing from a compare perspective. But these objects, they look a little bit different when you do the comparisons. So when you look at, go back a day or see, it shows version numbers. So I can see that that has changed 6 times. So if I just compare it to this version to the live environment, I'll be able to see the differences. And I can revert back to any version number of that object in Entra ID. So it looks like I just changed the job title and it changed some group membership for me as well. Users and groups are fairly interesting from an Entra ID perspective, but most of those honestly are replicated from on-prem Active Directory. Now, if you delete a user on-prem, and that deletion is going to synchronize to Entra ID. So you should recover the object on-prem and then let that synchronize back to Entra ID and reconnect everything. If you're changing user objects once they get to Entra ID, populating some other attributes and things like that, and maybe adding them to some Entra ID only groups, things like that, it's going to be necessary to recover it in Entra ID as well after it is synchronized. The same thing for groups. But the big questions come up around things like conditional access policies. So that's one, you can't go recreating these anytime you mess one up or do things like that to make a change. In this case, we can recover your conditional access policies as well. App registrations and enterprise applications are covered as well. So taking care of across the board from an Entra ID recovery.
Then another question.
Mm-hmm.
Can we can we list an inventory of users in AD and Entra ID from this console?
An inventory. So
An
basically
inventory
take a
list.
list and just make an output list of all of them.
Exactly.
Not really. It's not really designed to do that. I mean, I might be able to do something from a reporting perspective to say all of the things that changed. Like for instance, here's an OU comparison. Like if I come into this DC right here and look at comparison, I can see all the changes
The changes.
from an output perspective. I don't know what that would look like. Let me see here. We'll take a look. So this is an OU compare. It just compared every object in an OU and shows me all the changes. And then I can look at it from an attribute perspective and I can see before and after values. So this is what's in the backup. This is what's in the live environment. As far as output goes, I mean, I imagine you could, it doesn't really output here, but it's not going to output, just take the users and output them and give me a list of users. It's not
Understood.
really designed to do that. But I
Well,
could take any of these and recover them, any of these attributes individually and recover them this way.
so all these attribute changes are recorded here, and you could compare them real time anytime.
Yeah, I mean, it's taking the backup and saying, this isn't a real-time report. Let me say
Right.
that. It's like this
Right.
is a report I ran, an hour ago, but you can run this report anytime and compare it to any time that you have a backup for, or you can compare, last Thursday to last Friday and see the differences there. So if you had something where a user changed or privilege was elevated over that time, you could do like a domain-wide comparison between those 2 days and see a lot of differences and be able to narrow something down to exactly what happened.
Perfect.
And this is right out of the backup. So you don't really need, if you go backup to backup, you don't even have to have a domain controller online to be able to run that report.
Understood.
Yeah. So that's granular recovery of on-prem AD, and that's granular and object and attribute level recovery of Entra ID, both of those. The next point here, the big point in the discussion is forest level recovery. So forest level recovery would be not when a domain controller fails. We don't recover domain controllers. Most AD admins never would recover a domain controller. You just go build another one. It's fine because they're pretty much the same everywhere. But we're talking about something happened in Active Directory that's going to require you to recover the whole forest, whether that was a schema corruption or something catastrophic that happened where a ransomware event took down your entire directory. And I say that because, for the most part, Active Directory is the easiest thing to attack because users are involved and users are always going to lead to compromise. But once you compromise Active Directory, or once an attacker has access to Active Directory, they can use AD to attack the rest of your environment through some of the functionality within AD, things like group policies and that sort of thing. So they can take a malware package and distribute software with that, and that can be linked in a group policy that's tied to the domain controllers OU or the domain OU, and then all of that information is just pushed out to every domain joined system within 90 minutes. So it's kind of hard to fight once someone's in the front door. So that's where we're talking about actually recovering Active Directory. From here, I have 5 different forests brought in for different reasons. I've got something like this is my Northwind Traders forest. This is a single domain forest. So the first thing we do when we recover Active Directory, we build a backup plan and we get it backing up, right? Figuring out how we want to back it up based on how we want to recover. And we do that by deploying an agent, and then that agent discovers your forest architecture. In this case, you can see it's very flat. I have 8 domain controllers. I can see that most of them, all but one of them, are DNS servers. For some reason, I didn't put DNS on this server. I can see global catalog servers. I can see all of my FSMO role holders, which happen to be on a single domain controller. But this one was designed specifically because I had a customer that wanted to see how quick I can recover 8 domain controllers with 40,000 users in the forest. So we just built one and ran it. Based on this information, we build run books. So I've got some run books in here. I've got one that goes to production. I've got it flagged do not run. That's the break glass. If I really needed to run that run book, it would recover to production. And of course, that will interfere with production. So don't accidentally recover your forest into production. If you do that, you'll probably have to recover your forest. So just don't do that. But I have many different isolated recovery environment run books. So looking at this one, it's pretty simple, but let's back up one notch here and we'll look at a different forest here. We'll look at the mega brew forest, which is a multi-tree, multi-child forest. This is more respective of what we typically see. You know, a single domain forest is great. I mean, they're great to recover. It's great to build a recovery plan. It simplifies a lot of things when you're talking about recovery. But a lot of organizations have these empty forest routes that Microsoft told us to build between the years 2000 and 2005. Then they said, stop doing that. You should have never done that in the first place. Like, all right, well, I'm stuck with it. You can't really change it. So you see a lot of complicated forests. So when we discover this forest, it looks a little bit more complicated. It's because I have multiple trees and child domains. And I've even seen a few with, we call it grandchild domains, where you have a domain underneath a child domain. So those create, another layer of recovery. So based on this information, I've discovered all my forest. I know where my global catalogs are. It shows me where the FSMA role holders are, but believe it or not, that's not that important in forest recovery, knowing where they are to start, because we're going to put them where we want them when we do the forest recovery anyway. Based on this information, we're going to build run books. So again, I've got a full recovery to isolated recovery environment. I've got a minimum viable recovery. To me, minimum viable is a great practice run because that brings back a single domain controller from each domain, proves that my Active Directory is alive and I can use that. Let's dive into this one right here. So what we do is we set up our run book. We're building our run book based on how we want to recover. For these, I've chosen my recovery option for each domain controller. And I've got two options. I can create a new domain controller VM from backup. So that takes a system state backup of a domain controller and builds me a virtual machine out of it. Or I could promote a server to a domain controller. That's basically a DC promo step. To do this second step, I need to have the first step done. I have to have a domain controller to replicate from. So keep that in mind. That's a little bit of a faster step, but I also have to have a spare server sitting there ready to become a domain controller when I need it. So once I have all that identified and the decisions I've made here, it builds me runbook steps. These are divided into three phases. So we have to recover the first DC in the forest root first. Then we have to recover the first DC in each child domain first. Now, in this minimum viable, I'm stopping right there and calling it good. After that, you would recover additional domain controllers from backup. Or you would use some DC promo steps to promote servers into those domain controller roles. Underneath here, we have a ton of sub steps, right? So there's a lot going on under the covers. We're going to do things like, we got to isolate the recovery environment. We got to make sure whether you're going to production or you're going to an isolated recovery environment. If you're going to production, you still need to isolate, and all of the domain controllers that the corrupt domain controllers and everything need to be off. In this case, I'm sending it to an isolated environment, so I've thrown a little bit right here to say skip this step. But the first real thing we're doing down here is we're going to build the first VM. So we're going to build a VM, which is MBDC 151. We're going to build that from backup. So here's the steps that do that. So you build the VM, install the Commvault update, disable Windows Update. We disable Windows Update during a forest recovery because we don't want it pulling Windows updates. We don't want it possibly rebooting when we're doing a complicated step. That's not really going to be a factor here because it's going to an isolated network anyway, but it's just something if you decided to, you could skip that step if you wanted to. If you wanted to have it build the VM and wait for you, you can throw a pause in right there and it'll stop and wait while you're running the recovery. I can also flip this switch while it's running and it'll stop and wait for me. But then you got to do stuff like mark sysvols authoritative, suspend replication. Here we're going to seize all the forest FSMA roles to the first DC that's recovered. We're going to raise the RID pool. If you decided you wanted to raise the RID pool yourself, if you don't know what that is, you have to log onto the domain controller, open up ADSI edit, browse to an attribute, find an attribute in ADSI edit that's a string number about this long. You add 100,000 to it, open up Windows Calculator, and cut and paste that back in. If you wanted to do that yourself, you can skip that step and throw a pause on the step before, and it'll stop and wait for you to go raise the RID pool. If you
So
skip it without
Dan,
actually
I got a
raising it, it's going
question.
to be a problem. Yes.
Are there predefined run books or templates that we can use? Is this
This is
predefined?
it. This is it.
Fantastic.
There's one way to
Fantastic.
recover a forest. Yeah. And it has to be done in this order. Right. You
Awesome.
can't rearrange these steps. Things won't work right. So, we're going to get down into resetting the computer account. We're going to remove the global catalog because we're going to rebuild it and put it back. We got to configure Windows Time Service. They have to be done in this order. We reset the KRB TGT service account 2 times to void cold and ticket attacks right here. We have some manual steps that are skipped by default where we don't do anything here. We're not going to do this for you, but if you wanted to reset all privileged account passwords, this is where you would do that. And it's up to you to figure out what accounts are actually privileged. So after that, you're going to get into, this is the other root DC in Vandelay Industries, same thing. Then you're going to go to child domains, all this. I'm going to kick off the recovery right here, and we can actually talk through it and change it while it's being recovered. I'm going to send it to a non-production network. I'm sending it to a hypervisor. I'm actually logged into the hypervisor I'm going to send it to. Oops, wrong command. Let's do this one. Wrong hotkey. So we're going to send this. Here's the DCs that I'm actually going to recover. I can still change this before I hit the button. This is the point in time. So I'm just going to take the last backup that ran. I've got credentials inside every domain to execute forest level recovery commands. They're loaded here. These are where all my virtualization is going to go. So like when this DC gets recovered, it's going to come back with this IP address, and this is the client group, and this is the target hypervisor it's going to use. It's all designated in my runbook. I need a recovery node. This is a machine outside of Active Directory that will have access to those recovered machines. Hyper-V is really easy to use for this from a hypervisor perspective, because I can actually use it as my recovery node as well. If you're using VMware or something like that, you just spin up another VM in there. If you're using Azure VM, you would just drop a VM in that Azure node that you're going to use. Again, one last look at my runbook before I hit start, and then we'll type forest recovery again. And we're going to launch the runbook. Now we're going to look at the hypervisor here and watch it start creating domain controllers. As soon as I get this configured, here's my hypervisor over here. I'm going to pin this like that so we can see the hypervisor. And this is another forest running. This is Northwind Traders running over here, but we're going to watch it start creating domain controllers right up here. So if I expand the runbook, here we can see it's creating the new DC right there. Give it a minute. There we go. Just created 5 domain controllers.
Dan, this is not bad for your first time.
Yeah, I've never done this before, but I heard it'll work. So yeah. So it's going to start firing up these DCs. So that's the forest root. I'm going to organize them in the same order that they were in my view, where it showed me the logical architecture. It's 157. We'll go get 156. That's the root or the child under this one. So it's bringing those up. This is 77, which is the Vandelay Industries tree over here. And this is java.vandelay. So we can see I'm recovering 5 DCs. Now I said we had to recover the forest root first. What's going to happen is they're all going to recover at the same time from a VM perspective, but the orchestration is going to complete in the forest root. The child DCs are going to stop and wait for the orchestration to complete in both roots before they continue in the child domains. So it makes it a lot quicker when the DCs are all ready to go. And this will recover up to 8 domain controllers at a time. So if you had, say, 65 DCs in your forest, say a single domain forest with 65 domain controllers, in that case, it'll recover the first one first, then it'll recover all the rest of them in groups of 8. So you'd have, 8 runs of it to complete the job. And each one of these, the DC recoveries, takes about 20 to 25 minutes, depending on the weather. Sometimes, I don't know. But what's happening in the background here is we've actually mounted a Windows PE image. That Windows PE image has a Commvault agent on it. It's going to talk back to my CommServe, and start pulling backup data across. It's going to configure the VM, configure the Windows PE, and then it's going to pull the backup data over top of it. So these are all Server 2019 and 2022 OSs. They will end up as the same OS they were before. So, I mean, the same desktop profiles, the same documents in the same place, whatever you had there on that DC will be there. We're starting to come up here. We'll start to, I can cut 30 seconds off my recovery by clicking that OK button on each DC. So right now it's actually reaching back and pulling information to build the VMs, and we can expand these a little bit too. And just I like to watch them go to see what's happening. So if I zoom in on, look at this forest root DC right here, we'll zoom in on this one a little bit. We can see that it's actually querying back to ComServe, and it's pulling that information across. So it's mounted Windows PE, and then it's going to pull all that information back just like it was right out of that system state backup. While this runbook is actually executing, I can still make changes to it. So if I still wanted to throw a pause in right here, I can do that. If I still wanted to open my Windows calculator and do the raise the RID pool myself, I can put a pause on the FSMO roll seizure and then raise the RID pool myself right here. I'm not going to do that. But once that's done, we're going to recover all of these DCs. One DC from each domain in this case, so this is 5 total. I'm going to configure DNS, which means I'm going to set DNS up for the DCs. I'm going to clean up the DNS table. I'm going to put the global catalogs back as well. So those are going to rebuild. You're going to have fresh global catalogs. We're going to clean up any metadata. So if there was a domain you chose not to recover, it's going to be wiped out. In that case, I'm not recovering all the domain controllers here. You can see that there's several domain controllers I'm not recovering for this minimum viable. This metadata step will clean those up as well. And then we do some hygiene checks. So we're going to verify that global catalogs are advertising. This is actually a DC diag step where it's going to give me a health check on the DCs that is being recovered. We can redistribute the FSMO roles if we want to. You don't have to. We're going to resume replication. We will even re-enable the Windows Update service if you choose to do that. So it should be back just like it started. So what questions do we have? Is there anything in the chat so far?
And you did such a great job. There's no questions in the chat, and I had some pre-canned questions that scratching my head here because you answered all of them during the demo.
Well, I mean, yeah, feel free to circle back. I go pretty fast through this. I've done it a couple of times, so you let me know. I mean, whether it's a granular recovery question, Entra ID, let me know.
What we'll do is we'll pause for a question while this continues running. I guess if anyone has a question, feel free to raise their hand. I believe the chat is not working because of security measures from AIT. So if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand in the Teams, and we'll unmute you.
We can zoom in again here and see what's going on with this DC. It has actually provisioned the hard disks. We can see here it's built the disks based on what came out of the backup, and now it's doing a full system restore.
Having worked with AD in the past, in my past life, really the level of the amount of steps and the level of expertise required to do this without an automated template or an automated run book that provides you the necessary steps is impressive and definitely an add-on to any security personnel's tool belt for sure. Because there, as you can see, there are several steps and it requires a level of expertise. So again, not only have we showed we're able to back up those inventory, those identity assets, but restoring them is just as critical to the overall cyber resilience strategy or stance. So no, great job there, just going through those details and showing those granularities.
Yeah, sometimes I do circle in and I reference the Active Directory Forest Recovery Guide. If you haven't seen this, you can Google it. It's one of those things as an AD admin you know exists, but you hope you never have to use. But it does have some prereqs in here, right? You can't be attacked today and decide to recover today. So certain things like, determining how to recover and even doing things like determining how to back up, right? So you've got a lot of steps to recover the forest. You get into the procedure side, don't let these stump you, right? Like don't be, baffled. And it will tell you how to do it. Like I was mentioning raising the RID pool, I like to show this one because, here's the attributes you have to look for in ADSI edit. You have to go get the calculator. You add 100,000 to it, and then you paste this back in, and then I think there's a reboot right after this, and then you have to invalidate the RID pool. But little complicated tasks like that, it's good to understand what's going on, but you really don't want to have to do them. Like raising the RID pool. If you don't raise the RID pool in a forest recovery, you may be a month into the road after you've recovered your Active Directory, and you won't be able to create any new objects. So you're gonna run into a problem if you don't do all of these steps correctly. So it's very important to realize they're there, but hope you never have to do them.
Okay, so I guess Dan, on your end, you're good to go.
I am, and I'm going to sit around and watch the forest recover, but I don't expect everyone else will want to do that. But that's still kind of amusing to me to watch them recover. So
yeah, that's a great ROI. Definitely, pushing it back up to your management and everyone's looking to reduce the recovery time objectives or recovery point objectives. Those numbers are significant differences, 33 hours to, a little over an hour of recovery. So and no pressure, no one screaming over you to bring it back up
right.
under an emergency situation, right? So again, there is some level of effort required in creating those run books and getting organized and getting ready to run those tests on a regular cadence. But once those have been established, definitely you can reduce your recovery time objective.
Well, and you can practice as well, Ernesto. So that was the thing
Exactly.
of if you need to be able to prove that you can recover Active Directory, this is how I'm proving it. Get comfortable with Active Directory recovery, so when the world is on fire, that you can actually recover AD pretty easily.
Great question, Brian. Thank you. Any other questions? As I mentioned, Dan, you did a great job. We again hit on the points discussed at the beginning of the call. Really, the recovery was the main focus. How granular we can get, and how automated that whole recovery process is with Commvault. So, thanks again, Dan, for driving us through that great demo.